Cool. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for coming out. Big for providing both the food and the space, and Garrett for chaperoning us while we're in the space. Tonight we're very fortunate to have Emily Robinson. She's both a senior data scientist at Game Data Pros and the co-author of the book, Build a Career in Data Science. So we'll go ahead and kick it off to her then.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, so far so good. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, yeah, that looks right. So hi everyone. Hopefully you came to the right meetup and you're hoping to learn about an introduction to machine learning in AWS. This is actually, apologies, this is slightly the wrong link for the slide. This is for the R version of it. If you add an underscore pi to the end of that link, that will take you to these slides. I'll also share that at the end. So, before we get started, a little bit about what this talk will cover. Why and the what of the cloud in AWS. How do you connect to AWS from Python on your computer? Helpful AWS terms and libraries, and using those libraries to upload images to Amazon's storage system, train an image classification model, and evaluate the model's performance. Now, I only have about half an hour or so here today, so there's a bunch of things this talk will not cover. Oh, and how to learn more. It won't cover ML using any other cloud technology. So for example, Azure or Google Cloud, this will just be focused on machine learning in AWS, although some of the concepts would apply to any cloud, but a lot of the packages I talk about are specific to AWS. Math or theory behind the model. So this image classification model we're going to use is one of the models offered by AWS. I won't really talk at all about what's behind it. AWS offers some insight into it, but it's not really a clear box model. Any other algorithm, so how to do bring your own model or how to use their XGBoost. It's just going to focus on image classification. And finally, how to make a good model, and you'll see why I say this in a little bit. The background. How did I come to AWS? And also, what the heck is the cloud? Now, probably at this point, most of you are familiar with this, but I liked my co-author's Jacqueline's tweet back in 2019, which is basically you can think of the cloud as expensive sky laptops. So I think we understand this a little more now, but at first you'd be like, ooh, the cloud. And really it's just like a bunch of servers farms, right? Like there's still physical machines somewhere. You just don't have to operate them and keep them secure, right? And essentially you can rent them from, again, Amazon or Google or Microsoft. And AWS is Amazon Web Services, and they have a bunch of products. So these are like the suites of products, and in these, like in analyticals, there's like 6 AWS products, right? It's like if you look through the menu, there's just a ton. And specifically, we'll be talking about SageMaker, which is really kind of their flagship product for machine learning. And as you can see, SageMaker has a bunch of components that takes you from, they have some tools for preparing the data, all the way to deploying and managing your model. And why would you use the cloud for machine learning? Well, one reason, as Brandon put here, is it looks good on your resume. So basically, if you have a problem, you can build a deep Bayesian transformer running on multi-cloud Kubernetes and put that on your resume and the SQL query about with oversimplifying assumptions in production, and everyone goes home happy. But really, one of the main benefits of the cloud is to get access to a very powerful machine. So most problems, certainly not all machine learning problems need a powerful machine. But my journey started doing a deep learning problem on millions of images, and that actually was a really good case for getting off my laptop. You can also start with our model blueprint. So as you'll see, we can start with AWS's image classification model. Rather than setting one up from scratch, we can basically set a few parameters and get it running. And finally, that full pipeline you saw, so in AWS, you can store your data, train your model, create an endpoint for real-time inference, monitor performance. The last thing in my case, at my last company, Warby Parker, our data is prescription data for glasses, and even whether people order, that's all HIPAA data. It's all protected. And so I couldn't, if you work with that data, you need to keep that in the cloud. You should not download it on your computer. And other industries are like that too. And so if they're in the cloud on, say, AWS and S3, then it's secure and you can keep it there, and you can train your model there. It's very hard to train your model on your computer without access to any of the data. So why AWS? Well, as I said, it's basically because it's what my former company used. But really, if you're working now, if your company already uses the cloud technology, I definitely recommend looking at their ML tools. One of the main reasons you already have a vendor agreement with them, so you don't have to get that set up, right? Presumably your company is fine with storing, if the data you need for your model is there, that they're fine with storing your data on there. But if you're starting from scratch, there's a lot of options out there. A lot of them have free tiers or free credits. I don't particularly know if any one of these is, probably AWS is the most common by a bit in industry, followed by Google Cloud and then eventually Azure. But you could also see, what I recommend last week to learn R Python, you could see, okay, is there a commonality in the jobs that I'm looking for, that they're all listing AWS or they're all listing Google Cloud? In that case, maybe learn that one. So the biggest thing I was worried about when I got started was, how does pricing work? Right, that's the problem with going off your laptop that you've already paid for and the Wi-Fi you've already paid for, is renting these machines, once you go outside the free credits or the free tier, costs money. So SageMaker bills by the hour. So I was worried, well, what if I put a really intensive job? Can I rack up, tens of thousands of dollars? And the answer is only if it keeps running. So whether if you rent out a certain instance, it will just charge you that flat rate that it tells you on this pricing page link to it costs per hour. And it goes all the way from 5 cents an hour to $28 an hour. So again, there's, as long as you monitor, okay, how long am I renting this for? How long am I running on this for? You won't be able to rack up a bill higher than that on SageMaker. Some of the things SageMaker offers is certain things automatically stop when they're done. So a training job, when you train your model, when you start that, it spins up the machine, right? It starts billing you, but as soon as the training is done, it spins down that machine and stops billing you. There are also things on SageMaker. They offer essentially a Jupyter Notebook environment for testing things. That doesn't automatically stop unless you set certain rules, but you can stop that. It will save everything on there. It just may take a few minutes to restart. The other thing they've added to keep people from having surprise bills is you actually need to submit a support ticket to use the beefier machines. So when I did this project, I had to submit a support ticket basically being like, please let me pay for your more expensive machines. And this wasn't like the 28, like $6 or $7 an hour. So that's another thing they put around you to keep you from accidentally using one of those $28 machines. And you can always see your bill on AWS billing, and you can set budget alerts. So it will email you if you go over a certain amount. So how I got started in AWS was basically this. So I was just really thrown into the deep end, and a bridge list of things that I didn't know before this project include image classification, the cloud, deep learning, AWS SageMaker SDK, what SageMaker, what an SDK was, and like I said, the pricing point. Would I accidentally rack up a $30,000 bill and get fired? But as I said, at my job, I needed to. This project came up as a possibility, and I wanted to tackle it. I wanted to bring this new capability back to the team for other machine learning projects, but also hopefully deploy this one. Unfortunately, confidentiality means I can't talk about that project that I did. So instead, I'm going to talk about a personal project on the hardest ML problem of our time, which is a dog an 11 out of 12 or 13 or 14 out of 10? If you're not familiar with this is a great Twitter account, WeRateDogs, and basically people submit photos of their dogs, and the Twitter person will share the dog's photo, and then his rating. So we can see here, the one on the left is a 12 out of 10, on the right is 14 out of 10. And if you're wondering what kind of ratings are these, so was Brandt. And he said, well, you give every dog 11 and 12, it doesn't make any sense. And as WeRateDogs says, they're all good dogs. And shockingly enough, it's actually his full-time job. So we had this interaction with the dentist, which is like, yeah, I've effectively monetized a Twitter account where I numerically objectify dogs. And I was wondering here, okay, so he takes an image, he gives it a rating, and our model take an image and give it a rating. So this part I still did in R. I actually haven't translated it to Python. This is your reason to use it, I guess. But if you know how to do it in Python, the basic idea is just get the images from the tweets, parse the text of the tweets to associate the images with their rating, rescale them all to be the same size. At least at the time I first did this project in October 2021, SageMaker does change things occasionally. At least at the time, the image classification algorithm required all of your input images to be the same size. And then finally, I divided this into a training, validation, and pulled out forward. So who thinks a model with 356 images, a deep learning model, and clearly a really sophisticated algorithm behind the ratings and how they associate ratings to images, who thinks this model did really well? No, this model did really badly, but it ran. And I wanted to make a simple model just to show you the steps of training a image classification model. And as I said at the beginning, it is not about training a good one. That is a whole different talk about how many images you need and hyperparameter tuning and much more than that. But this is really just the mechanics of, I have a machine learning problem, maybe specifically an image classification. How do I use SageMaker to train that model? So, bit of a disclaimer before we start into the code is that there's going to be a lot of it. And hopefully this code will be totally new to you, or at least mostly new. You're probably in the wrong talk. So please don't worry about memorizing the code. I do show all of it just because I want to show basically step-by-step how it works. But the point was that you memorize it. The point is that you can go to GitHub afterward. I'll have the link to the slides at the end again, which has a link to the GitHub. I'm Robinson ES on most platforms, so you can go to the GitHub, you can find the code. So please don't worry about memorizing it. So your first step, and I've linked to where this comes from, is you have to create an AWS account. They've also, I think now sort of enforced that to be different than your personal Amazon account. Once you create an AWS account, you have to create your keys. And basically what this is you need to authenticate when you're working on your laptop and you're sending stuff up to SageMaker or AWS. AWS SageMaker needs to know who you are and that you have permission to do so, right? You set up your security credentials. So you have an access key and a secret access key, and you save those on your computer. You save those on your computer on this file, credentials in .aws. Obviously, these are not my real credentials, but you copy your real access key, your real secret access key, and then your region. And AWS will know when you call functions in its packages, it will know to go here, find your keys, and that way it can authenticate. The packages we'll be using today, SageMaker and Botto 3 are kind of specific AWS ones. Botto 3 is kind of a general purpose AWS package. SageMaker is an AWS package for SageMaker. Probably most of you know pandas. OS is some file stuff I'm doing. So first, we create the S3 client and the bucket. So S3 is the storage system. What creating the client here is, like I said, Botto 3 is kind of a general purpose AWS package. So I want to say, let me do the stuff with S3 because S3 is a specific product in AWS. So basically, give me the access to the functions that have to do with S3. So I say I want my client to be S3. I create this S3 object, and then I call the function create bucket. And I create a bucket. It's essentially a folder called WeRateDogs up in S3. And I create this so I can upload the images to it. Because when I train my model, I'm going to say, go find the images in S3. This is probably not very good Python code, but basically all it's doing is it's using the function upload file, and it's uploading the file to the bucket WeRateDogs, keeping the file name and the key. You can view your files in S3, right? So if you can always go back to AWS in the web browser, and I can see, yes, I successfully uploaded these objects, these pictures of the dogs, JPEG. We also need to upload the data about, okay, for these images and these paths, what is the ground truth about whether they're rating? And I made it binary just to make the problem easier. So if they're 11 out of 12, I said they're a 0. If they're a 13 or 14 or 15 out of 10, I said they're a 1. So we upload, this is a .list file for some unknown reason. We upload that to AWS, and now when the model is training, it will know where to look for the ground truth. Sorry, and then that was creating them, then I upload them. So this was kind of just the stuff getting ready, getting our stuff in S3, the images themselves and the data about the images. Now we go to the SageMaker code. One thing that really confused me when I started was that SageMaker actually has 2 levels of APIs. There's the low-level one on the left and the high-level on the right. The low-level one, you might not be surprised, is more flexible, but it's more verbose, and most of the time you're not going to need what it offers over the high level. So I would usually recommend using the high-level API, but if you get confused when you look at docs, like why is there this different way of doing this, it might be because it's at a different level of API than you've been working in. And in general, it's good to get used to that AWS has a lot of ways of doing something. So I really like this meme about 17 a lot, depends on the context. Ways to deploy containers on AWS, yes. And I think now there are 19 ways to deploy containers on AWS, like 19 different services to do that. So in general, this is just the thing you'll have to get used to is, you know, and there's sort of the reason for it is backward compatibility, and sometimes you want to do different, you know, you have different use cases for deploying containers, and one product they offer may be better than the other, but in general, you'll find this when you start looking at AWS documentation. But the good news is there is also a lot of documentation. So our next step is we need to create an IAM SageMaker role, and basically what this is we need to give our user permissions to do things with SageMaker. So by default, you don't have permission to do anything you want on AWS, even within your account. You have to make a role. So this walks you through how to create that role and give you SageMaker full access in that role. So this way, we'll be able to use all of the SageMaker API functions. So now, just as we did botto3.client parentheses quote S3, we are now instead want to interact with the IAM set of functions. So we can, from IAM, we can get role, we can get the SageMaker role we just created and get the ARN. And that's what we're going to use in our functions to say, hey, when I'm asking to do stuff with SageMaker, look, I do have the permissions to do it. Then we need to create an estimator. So the training image is a Docker image. And as I said, Amazon is offering us an image classification algorithm. And so the training image is saying this is what, you know, where all the things it needs to run, the algorithm, all the packages and whatnot on this training image. And then the estimator we set up, we say, okay, first, this is a training image, the role. We then set up various things about the instance, or basically the computer we want it to train on. So I want to train on an ML P2 extra large. How to know which to train on? Sometimes the algorithm about page will give you some advice. They'll say generally you need an image of at least this much vCPU, or you need at least, you know, we recommend these 3 instances. You can also go by the pricing page. You probably don't want the $28 one. You can also, as I do, run the model for 12 hours until it runs out of memory. And then you say, oh, I got to upgrade the instance. So there's a variety of ways to do it. The last kind of stuff is basically just saying the input is going to be files. I want the output to go to this S3 bucket. And some things about the session. So we've kind of set up kind of the boilerplate for our model. We set the hyperparameters next. Again, this talk is not really about how to set good hyperparameters. Some of these come from the data itself, like how many training samples do you need, or do you have, sorry, how many classes are there? In our case, right, that's 2. Then there's some things like mini batch size, epochs, right? Which again, Amazon has a little bit of documentation about what these are, but if you want to learn, well, how do I set a good mini batch size? How do I know what's the right number of epochs? I'll show at the end, there's a variety of good resources about deep learning in general. So we create the data channels, format, and location of our data. And basically what this is we're telling SageMaker where to find our actual image files for the training and validation sets, and then that LST file for where's the ground truth about what rating does this file have, right? What class does it belong to? And finally, we train the model. So after all that, we can go into our console, we can see the model is training. More realistically, this is what it looked like. You will probably have some things like this where it will fail and then you click it and you see what went wrong. Oh, I forgot to specify this, or this shouldn't have been coded. Hopefully that's a little less so if you actually take this code and use it to get running. But it's fine. You can see it usually fails pretty quickly. It's a couple minutes. And again, mostly I think this instance is like 12 cents or something a minute. So yeah, so you might have some failures, but hopefully eventually it runs. I said you can view your logs. And it actually shows you what were the metrics at each epoch. So sort of each run through the data, what was the accuracy for the training set and the validation set. Now, maybe this doesn't look so bad, but a funny thing about SageMaker is actually I have to run another piece of code to get back what were the predictions for the individual of the final model for the individual images in my training and validation set. So this just gives me a nice peek into overall accuracy, but it does not say if I want, a confusion matrix or I want to understand something more granular, I need to do what's called a batch transform job. And a batch transform job basically lets you put a lot of images up at once in the model, this trained model, and get back out its predictions. So for some reason, maybe they've made it better since then, but for some reason, like this is their recommended code for getting back what those results are. I don't know why they don't have a simpler way to get the output of, I just want back, okay, great. I looked at I ran all my images through my model. What did it get back? But unfortunately, it's this code. And spoiler alert, as I said, how'd the model end up doing? So who here has a guess about model without a lot of images, trained on accuracy, that had an imbalanced class size? What do we think happened? Yes. It was very high, exactly. Predicted everything was low, that every dog, because something like 69% of dogs had a rating of 11 or 12, aka a low rating. It just predicted that, right? Again, this was not about making a good model. Probably all of you know, like this is the problem with accuracy as a metric. But unfortunately, AWS actually doesn't let you use, or the image classification, you can't use something else as your optimization metric. But I kind of hope by walking you through that it showed maybe it's actually not as scary as it seemed. Like there was a fair amount of code on that screen, but honestly, I'm not sure it was that much more than making an image classification model from scratch and choosing how many layers and all of those things. And there's a lot of documentation around obviously the code in this presentation, but AWS has a ton of docs. So if you want to learn more, SageMaker has, AWS offers example notebooks. There are documentation for the Python SDK. There's a developer guide. In terms of deep learning specifically, Francois Cholet's book, which I've actually been working through, is excellent. It's recommended by basically everyone I know who's read it, who's in this space. So I definitely recommend that for if you're like, what's an epoch? How do I choose a mini batch size? That's where I'd recommend going. The top takeaways say it's actually pretty hard, but not impossible to rack up a huge bill with SageMaker. But I do want to emphasize it's not impossible, but I think maybe compared to some other AWS services, You know, or maybe if you set up an endpoint that automatically scales and suddenly your website gets a bunch of traffic, like maybe then you could have it, but probably for a toy example, because it's billed hourly, because you have pretty, you know, clear insight into how long it's running, it should be pretty hard to rack up a big bill. But there's a lot of ways, resources for and ways to do things in AWS. That's part of why I made this talk, was not that there are no resources out there on how to do this, but it was kind of scattered around. Some things didn't work right away. And I sort of wanted a little bit closer to a hello world. And so, but you know, if you get more advanced, you'll start seeing that there is documentation for most things out there. There's a lot to learn, right? Like I said, this talk didn't even cover a bunch of things. You know, SageMaker, you can set automatic hyperparameter tuning jobs. You know, you can, you know, you could use ground truth for labeling your data, but don't let that intimidate you, right? Like you can get value doing, you know, by just doing one piece and one step at a time. And finally, I really want to thank my co-author of my book, Jacqueline Nolis. She helped me with the slide design. Dave Robinson for some code advice. My former manager and teammates at Warby Parker. And of course, all of the good dogs, which is every dog. And if you want to see these slides, as I said, this is the correct link. So bit.ly/AWSDogs_pi. I have a blog, it's called touchdowndata.org. I haven't written about AWS on it, but I have some other things around Python and R and A/B testing if you're interested in that kind of thing. Or if you're interested more in kind of career advice, I wrote a book called Build a Career in Data Science. It's at datascicareer.com. Or you can use so I think this says something about my co-author and I. That was the URL shortener I came up, or alias I came up with. Hers is bestbook.cool. So that will also work and get you to the book. But yeah, with that, just thanks again for coming out here. It's really fun being back in person again. And I'd love to take questions if you have any.
I have a question. You said that one of the other is something grab a bunch of topics and create a conversation based on those.
I think it depends. I certainly think you could do that with SageMaker. I did hear just today, ChatGPT announced they're going to have a business subscription, which I think is going to matter a lot. I don't know if that's professional or personal, but professional wise, I know some employers are like, please don't upload anything to ChatGPT about us, right? Because they can use that in their training data, IP protection, all of that. But their business plan, maybe we'll sort of protect against that. They've said that basically they won't use it to train their model. Yeah, so I think it depends. It's also hard to say, you know, if it's by the end of the year, 5 months from now, right? What will ChatGPT do? I think SageMaker, in some ways, will have more structure around it, as in it will sort of guide you through a bit more, but maybe you'll find ChatGPT out of the box is actually pretty good. Like, you know, you can just use some sort of common language and get it. So yeah, I'd be curious what you end up doing, but I don't know that there's a clear answer. Oh yeah.
I'm just here as an attendee, but there was a recent announcement by Amazon that there's a new product called Bedrock, which is basically a front end for SageMaker that will allow you to pick your own LLM. So everybody's talking about ChatGPT right now, but there are a myriad of other logical language models out there, Jurassic, stuff from ATI, things like that. And the idea is that that landscape is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. So with the front end of Bedrock, you can kind of think of it as sort of like an API gateway into picking your own LLM, running it in your own model, and most importantly, to the point you mentioned, you control the data, keep it in your own environment, so you control who's doing what with your sensitive information.
I should always have something from Amazon in my talks. This is great. Yeah. Also, this was not sponsored by Amazon or AWS in any way. Yeah, he just lives.
Aside from the issues that you mentioned before with your project that you were working on, the passion project, what are like some of the other bottlenecks that you have faced while learning how to use SageMaker and other AWS tools that are within the AWS ecosystem?
Yeah, so one thing is some of the bottlenecks, yeah. So definitely the big ones I think were just like finding the right resources. And I Google and I find this doc and I'm like, okay, this links to this other doc, but this notebook says this thing, and what about this one? Partly that's also because a good thing is, but they change, right? Like things change. Like actually, it's not SageMaker, but right now I'm doing some more like data engineering stuff. And they had just introduced into Redshift, like doing a merge operation, right? Which they didn't have before. And it's like, well, gosh, now, if I hadn't been reading like the AWS news, like I wouldn't have known that. But some of their documentation is still outdated. Some of their documentation says you cannot do a merge in Redshift, right? So that's sort of, but I think that's just an issue. That would be an issue anywhere, right? With that amount of things. Trying to think of anything else. I think partly it's just like also how much you can do with it and like try not to get overwhelmed. So even if the documentation is clear, it's like, oh, what should I focus on? Is the best thing to be like, not in this toy example, but in a real project, should it be getting more data? Should it be, learning more about which hyperparameters matter? Should it be, learning how to do automatic tuning, hyperparameter tuning on SageMaker? Should it be about how to do, when is the model good enough? And, if it's good enough now, should I, work on getting into production, or should I keep tuning it? But what if it never goes to production? Yeah, so I'd sort of say there's like an endless list of things you could learn more about or things you could do to get a better end result, whether that's a technical thing or a business thing. And I don't know that there's really a right answer, but I think it kind of goes back to at least what I had said, which is sort of just this like one step at a time. Like one of my favorite books is called like Bird by Bird. And one of the stories in it is the author's brother, when they were kids, left this big school project to the last minute. He's supposed to like give a whole presentation on like 50 different birds he researched, right? It's supposed to take months. The night before, freaking out, and the father is, let's just take it bird by bird, right? There's like no other way to do it. You just sort of, you can't always look at the big thing. You just take it step by step. Look at the big thing a little bit to know where you're going, but bring it back to the present for what you're doing now.
All right. All right. Thank you. So when would you choose to use PyTorch or some other framework as opposed to Sage, what you're talking about?
SageMaker, yeah. So one of the nice things about SageMaker was, well, okay, it did take me a little while to get up and running because I had to like learn SageMaker, but once it was pretty smooth, like having that sort of image classification that they offer, right, with some tuning. I think you can get a faster start of that than kind of building from scratch, like a Keras model or a PyTorch model. That being said, I think, why wouldn't you use is, like I said, there are certain limitations. So there are certain hyperparameters you can't tune, there are certain things you can't change. And so if you really, maybe you try it out and you find like, I've done a little tuning, but I really need to do this thing and it can't, or this just isn't performing well enough, maybe then you kind of need to roll your own model. But in general, I would say this is like a fairly good starting point. Oh, and maybe the last thing would be, look, if you have used PyTorch or Keras or something else a lot and you're very comfortable with it, I don't think there's any reason necessarily to use SageMaker. That being said, the nice thing about SageMaker is you can kind of pick and choose parts of it you use. And you could use SageMaker to deploy a custom PyTorch model that you've made, right? Because you want SageMaker to handle scaling it up and making an endpoint for it, right? And receiving, the images and giving back the results as an API. And you could totally skip over having SageMaker train the model. So it's kind of up to you, but yeah, I would say if you are someone who hasn't done a lot with deep learning and you just kind of want to get started, learn a little bit, like deploy the model maybe for a toy project, it's kind of a nice way to start because it gives you that relatively easy access to like a powerful computer and, a sort of model blueprint.
So you mentioned that, I mean, obviously there's a toy example, and I'm just kind of curious your experience, and without getting any details about, kind of projects at scale that you've done, but just your experience with the SDK and some of the more complex elements of, AWS and SageMaker that you've experienced with, what elements of those have proved more troublesome than others? Like, I mean, you're using S3 here, you used EMR. Obviously, for a small data set like this, you could employ transfer learning. I don't know, is it fairly easy to implement those sorts of things within SageMaker? Or are there other elements that you used at scale that you found to be relatively easy or complex, or more complex?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's challenging with SageMaker is it can be a little hard to figure out, can it really not do this thing, or have I just not found it, right? And I would say that's a challenge I ran into. Sometimes the answer is it just can't do this thing. They didn't implement it, or they purposely chose not to. But sometimes it's like, oh, I'm looking in the wrong doc, or this is out of date, or I have to go look for something else. So that was one of the challenging parts doing at scale. The other thing I find is while the documentation is pretty extensive, like the SDK docs don't usually have examples, which I find a little weird, as in it will be like, here's the function, this is the estimator function, here are the arguments, here are like what each argument means, but they don't ever just show the function running, which kind of makes it hard to see exactly how it applies sometimes. So I wish they did that a little more. I'm trying to think of any other challenges. Yeah, I would say that biggest thing is, it's definitely not, in no way is it like all the way on kind of like a BI tool lens like Tableau, but at the same time, it's a little bit like that, like at least with R, I'm like, well, I know I can always figure out how to do it, right? Or like Python, right? There's some way I can hack at this language and I can build something to do this. And at SageMaker, you're like, well, I don't know if they built the capability for me to do this. Maybe I can extend and add on to it, but maybe that would be too much of a pain. And it's better for me to just kind of roll my own. So that can be sometimes a little challenging when you push it to the boundaries a bit. That said, I would recommend if you are at a company that's a customer of AWS or Google Cloud or whatever, you probably have some like enterprise support, depending how big you are. If you're a decent sized company and so are support engineers, and I used that at my last company, and that was helpful sometimes because they could be like, oh yeah, we don't offer that. That's an upcoming thing that we will offer. Or here actually that it wasn't that clear, but let me walk, sometimes we even got on the call and they'd like walk me through some code they wrote to do it. Because it's in their interest, especially if, say, your company uses AWS a lot for S3, but hasn't done SageMaker, they would love for you to use SageMaker, right? And spend like tens of thousands more dollars. So they would, if you're a big enough company, they think that's plausible, there's probably some support folks on their side that can help. Feel a little weird saying that with someone from Amazon in the audience, but from the other side, that was my interpretation.
So say that you want to take this further, your model is performing awesome and you want to take it to the next step and hook it up to an API. Have you gotten that far yet with your models?
Yeah. So that's so SageMaker, that's kind of the next step. You can make a SageMaker endpoint, essentially like hooked up to your model. I believe it like scales essentially automatically, which is really nice. I'm trying to remember why. I wrapped it in an API gateway, right? Another AWS thing, to make it so basically, I think it was because I wanted to resize the image that was like, if someone sent over an image, I wanted to resize it, then hit the endpoint, then get it back. But yeah, so I didn't show it here, but that is like that's called SageMaker endpoint, and it's fairly straightforward once you've trained the model. I think you might even be able to just refer to that IC dot, like make an endpoint, I forget. But yeah, I've done that. It did not go, so I've done that, and that's how generally I would recommend doing it. And like I said, that's where I was saying earlier, even if you wanted to like bring your own model and not use a SageMaker trained model, you could still deploy that with the endpoint.
So did you have like a fast API service that's pointing to that endpoint?
So what I did was set up the API gateway. It's not getting to the point where I like hooked up for anything to be calling that API, but basically I set it up so it could, right? And the API gateway also, you can set up certain security, only, people from this, whatever IP, this thing can like hit this API and like get back what you want, but that's basically where I got to. So I haven't yet gotten to the like monitoring stage. Okay, great, we have our model running. How's it doing? How many times is it getting hit? But AWS does, SageMaker also offers products for that.
Cool. Thanks again, Emily Robinson.
I didn't bring my dog.